All right, sorry, I was muted. And my name is Seth. I'll be giving a presentation on the research done by Butcher and Peter A. et al., published 2017. And the title of the paper is "The Cerebellum Does More Than Sensory Prediction Error-Based Learning in Sensory Motor Adaptation Tasks," which is quite a mouthful. So starting us off, I'll just be breaking down that title, giving you some background in order to understand the rest of the research, and then I'll get into the research itself. And I'm sure I will come across as repeating myself, and if any part of this seems redundant, I just want to say I'm doing it for your benefit as well as mine, just to keep myself on track while I give this presentation. So hopefully it works out. What this research is focused on is understanding what the cerebellum's job is in general and making a case that the cerebellum plays a role in higher level cognition during some forms of motor learning. The concept is characterized by the understanding that the cerebellum has projections to other parts of the brain, creating a network that is crucial for explicit, not just implicit learning. And to what degree that is the case is the topic of this research. Background: the cerebellum is considered an older part of the brain connected to the brainstem, and its dense network of neurons comprises nearly 50% of all the neurons in the brain, allowing for robust motor learning. And one form of this learning is called sensory motor adaptation, which is an implicit process. One example is walking on ice and adjusting over the course of the day to the changes in the environment. How sensory adaptation is accomplished is through a mechanism called sensory prediction error. Generally, this happens when your cerebellum initiates a motor command and simultaneously generates a predicted sensory consequence of that movement. But when the cerebellum compares the actual feedback to what it predicted, that difference is called sensory prediction error. And more specifically, the cerebellum accomplishes this through the use of an internal forward model, which I've broken up here. Fundamentally, an internal model is simply a subjective representation of a motor command and sensations, and a forward model is the subjective prediction of an outcome. Another name for an internal model is what is known as an efference copy, which is only useful for the following diagram. What we see here is that on the left, a motor command is created by the cerebellum, and at the same time, there is an efference copy or internal copy of that motor movement, which gets fed into a forward model, producing a predicted sensory consequence of that action. And just going back, sorry, while all that's happening, the body was getting actual sensory feedback from the real world. And at this point, the cerebellum takes those two values and compares them. And those two values either match or don't match. And if they don't, this is recognized by the cerebellum and adjustments are made accordingly, leading to sensory motor adaptation. I'm just getting these buttons mixed up, excuse me. Just to drive this point home, let's say you reach out to pick up what you assume is a full cup of coffee. However, over the course of the day, all the coffee has been drunk, and when you actually pick up the cup, the cerebellum realizes it's recruited too many muscles for the task and dials back the lifting action in the hand, which is, again, a basic example of sensory motor adaptation. So getting back to the research article, let's make this situation more complicated. And a curious finding regarding the cerebellum's role in learning in general is the following example. Let's say you have someone with damage to the cerebellum. This damage will lead to deficits in sensory adaptation. However, you can give people with cerebellum damage explicit solutions to compensate for their deficit. This is shown via red and green arrows respectively. So this leads to the question, if people with damage to the cerebellum can implement an explicit strategy, why do we not see these people creating the solution on their own? In the middle of the screen, you will see a dartboard, and to illustrate this concept, let's say you introduce a perturbation to the system such that in order to actually hit the bullseye, you have to hit the offset bullseye to the right. Now, assuming no one told you this, a normal person would over time realize that aiming directly at the normal bullseye results in hitting the board off to the right. So once that understanding is explicit, a normal person will be able to implement an aiming strategy in order to actually hit the bullseye. They will adjust their aim and try and hit the board somewhere to the left of the bullseye to offset the perturbation. And what is interesting about this example is that if you ask someone with cerebellar damage to figure this out on their own, they would have problems with that. Yet at the same time, they would have no problem implementing the aiming solution once you told them. So this begs the question, are these individuals incapable of producing such solutions, or is it a matter of degree? In either case, this phenomenon suggests that the cerebellum is playing a critical role in some forms of explicit, not just implicit learning. Okay, so to tie all this together, if someone has damage to the cerebellum, we can easily understand why that leads directly to poor sensory motor adaptation or implicit learning problems. And this can be explained as a consequence of poor sensory prediction error on a ground level. But this again this account doesn't explain why people with cerebellar damage do not retain an intact mechanism to explicitly compensate for these implicit deficits. So before getting into the research, overall, we can appreciate the following. The cerebellum is part of a learning network that learns and maintains movement outcome associations across trials and is involved in explicit, not just implicit learning. And the research question, finally, the specific question here is, as I said before, in adaptation tasks, why do individuals with cerebellar damage not produce aiming solutions on their own to compensate for their implicit learning deficits? And this question was explored using a model, a visual motor rotation model task. And a visual rotation task is similar to the previous example with the dartboard, but as you can see on the right, instead of having a change in the placement of a bullseye, there is instead a discrepancy between the angle of hand movement in an attempt to reach out, towards a target. And instead of throwing a dart, you're sitting at a desk, moving your hand, trying to swipe towards a changing target. So to explain this more clearly, during a visual motor rotation task, you induce a discrepancy between what your hand is actually doing and what you visually see your hand doing. And aiming is defined in this task as choosing to move the hand toward a location other than the target, with the goal of having the cursor land on the target. So importantly here, remember for this task, aiming becomes an explicit measure to correct an experimentally introduced perturbation between what you do and what you see. A crucial part of this experiment will be using people with damage to the cerebellum, and this damage is specified as spinocerebellar ataxia, or SCA, which is a degenerative disease of the nervous system leading to poor coordination, such as abnormal speech and other things like that, and problems with general learning. This research is done using two groups of people, a control population with normal cerebellar function and an experimental population with spinocerebellar ataxia. The experiment will use a visual motor rotation task along with continuous assessment of aiming behavior to find out what is going on with individuals with SCA as compared with controls during these tasks. Some predictions moving forward are, we know CSA people will have problems with implicit adaptation, but to what extent will they have problems implementing an aiming solution? That is what this research is really getting at. And the basic experimental setup consists of 2 experiments. Experiment 1, where the visual motor rotation or discrepancy between action output and visual feedback is introduced all at once, compared with experiment 2, where that discrepancy is introduced gradually from trial to trial. Some assessments for screening experimental participants include the ICARS and SARA, which are both methods for evaluating the severity of the cerebellar damage, and cognitive impairment was measured using the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. And methods for experiment 1, starting us off, the experimental population consisted of 10 people with SCA with an average age of about 53. The group was comprised of 2 women, 8 men, 5 right-handed, and the cause of ataxia was twofold. 4 people had a genetic mutation leading to the disease. The other participants had what is known as sporadic adult onset ataxia with an unknown cause. Individuals with SCA were selected only if their damage was localized to the cerebellum and did not exhibit significant cognitive impairment. Researchers here were trying to limit damage to the cerebellum and motor learning only. Experimental population metrics continued. We get the average ataxia severity rating of 26.5 and an average cognitive impairment of 28. For the control population, we have 10 age-matched controls, 2 women, 8 men, 5 right-handed, no known neurological conditions, a cognitive average of 27.6, with 2 scoring below that cutoff range, but they were admitted into the experiment because their performance on the experimental task was similar to other participants. And for example, for experiment 2, we have very similar metrics. They tried to make the 2 populations as alike as possible. And we can see there's 10 individuals with SCA that were recruited, an average age of 48, 4 women, 6 men, 8 right-handed, 6 confirmed genetic subtype, ataxia severity evaluated using the scale for assessment and rating of ataxia severity. That difference in the ataxia evaluation was just a preference of the experimenters at the time, and the average SARA score was 10.6. Okay, so getting to the experimental apparatus. Oh, no. Well, sorry, I didn't get to the control population, which was, as you can see, 10 age-matched controls, average age of 53, 5 women, 5 men, 10 right-handed. Sorry, I just realized there's a typo. Wow. That's hard to believe. I'm just going to keep going. Average cognitive assessment was 25.5. And the experimental apparatus. Important things to note here are that the circle on the left contains numbers moving in a positive direction on the right and negative on the left. These are referred to as landmarks and are what the participants will report to the experimenter that they are aiming at before moving. And notice that due to the participants and change in target location, participants won't always report aiming for the same place, depending on the circumstances of the trial. The red dot is given as feedback to show the participants where the cursor is hitting in their attempts to hit the target. The red dot does not map onto actual hand movement. Specifics about the apparatus. The radius of the circle is 7 centimeters. This is referring to the actual distance the hand has to travel from the start position to the end of the circle. The monitor is between their eyes and their hand. And all people use their right hand no matter what their preference was, and feedback from the hand was represented on the screen by a circular cursor. How the participants got their hand in the correct starting position was to adjust in response to a circle that would shrink the closer they moved their hand to the middle of the circle and would disappear, starting the clock for them to complete the task. The task was to hit the green target. That could randomly appear in one of 8 possible locations. The 8 locations were all the same from trial to trial, located at the 12, 3, 6, and 9 positions if this was a clock, and the 4 remaining positions were spaced equidistant between the 4 previous locations. The goal was to move the cursor into the target location, and before starting the movement, you had to verbally report to the experimenter where you were aiming. And remember, because of the perturbation, your aim should not have always matched where the target actually was. The participants were instructed to slice through the target, emphasizing quickness of movement. And feedback was given for 1.5 seconds. In experiment 2, feedback was also given in the form of a visible cursor during their movement attempts. So another important difference between experiment 1 and 2 is that in experiment 1, once they got their hand in the target, in the start circle, the cursor disappeared. In both experiments, if the target was hit, an auditory signal sounding like a ding was given and a buzz sound if you missed. If you were moving too slow, a verbal too slow signal was given if you took longer than 400 milliseconds to finish the trial. In experiment 1, that abrupt rotation was an immediate 45-degree counterclockwise rotation of the cursor relative to the hand. And in experiment 2, this rotation was introduced gradually at a rate of 0.144 degrees per trial until the full 45 degrees was reached. In the figure below, we see the phases of experiment 1 and 2 broken up into 3 parts. For example, for experiment 1, we see an initial baseline phase where the task of hitting the target was target with the cursor has no rotation or what that means is no discrepancies between visual feedback and hand movement. Then a rotation is immediately introduced in the form of a square wave, and the experiment ends with the return to a no rotation phase. In this diagram, it is labeled as a no feedback phase because during this time, the experimenters will try and measure how much implicit learning has occurred within each experimental population by seeing if any remnants of motor adaptation in response to the rotation exists, even though the participants know that their hand movement maps onto what they see on the screen at the end. The only difference in experiment 2 is that the rotation phase is represented by a linear slope showing the gradual increase in the discrepancy between hand and vision. And also the rotation phase is longer in experiment 2, and I will explain why in a moment. And so these 3 phases are further divided into 5 blocks: a regular baseline block with participants just getting used to the experiment, a baseline report block where participants start reporting where they are aiming before starting to move, a rotation block which is made up of 128 trials in experiment 1 and 320 trials in experiment 2, and a washout block with no feedback. And finally, a washout block where they add feedback back in. And what is going on in the washout block is the experimenters again want to see how much implicit motor learning persists leaving the rotation block. The washout no feedback block, for this, there is no rotation. The cursor feedback is taken away and the landmarks are taken away. So again, participants are explicitly instructed to aim directly to the green target, and the participants hear a neutral knock sound once they moved outside the circle to know that the trial is over. For the final block, feedback is restored, so cursor feedback and aiming and landmarks are added back in. And Researchers analyzed the movement data with MATLABs and SPSS. In both experiments 1 and 2, task performance was defined as the angular difference between the target and initial hand movement. And this initial movement was determined by the first 3 centimeters from the start position. They chose initial heading angle instead of their ending point, because this measure was less susceptible to noise introduced by some symptoms associated with damage to the cerebellum. An estimate of implicit learning was generated by subtracting the measured hand heading angle from reported aiming angle. So this is a measure of the difference between what the participants were explicitly trying to achieve versus what they were actually doing. Importantly, this measure is different from task performance because it has no regard for the target location. Again, all that is being compared is aiming location and hand movement. You might assume that this measure might be pretty constant, and it is depending on the level of adaptation the participants have achieved. This is to say that at the end of the rotation block, you could imagine that a normal person has adjusted their movement to offset a 45-degree visual rotation. And what the experimenters are interested in is, once you take that rotation away, does the cerebellum have trouble immediately readapting to normal conditions, which is known as an after effect. And the degree of an after effect is representative of the extent of implicit learning that has taken place in the cerebellum during the rotation phase. And I'll go over all this again as well with the results. Movement analysis and data analysis. Sorry, I'm getting mixed up. For data analysis, trials were binned into groups of 8, and the means were reported for each bin. This is relevant to only some of the metrics, which I will get into shortly. So getting into the actual results, overall, in experiment 1, it was found that cerebellar damage affects both adaptation and aiming in response to visual rotation. And we have the following performance metrics displayed in the graph below. Hard lines are averages for each group, red being the experimental group, blue being the control group. Shaded lines are confidence intervals. What these graphs have in common, as you can see on the x-axis, is a division of trials indicated by the numbers 0 to 8, 8 to 56, 184 to 224, and 224 to 264. These map onto the division of the 5 blocks that are generally described by this chart at the bottom right. Importantly, we see the rotation block is from trials 56 to 184, and the 2 washout blocks are made up of 2 intervals from 184 to 224 and 224 to 264. We see the y-axis, and for graph A, we see the y-axis is a measure of hand heading angle, and what this graph is demonstrating in general is the change in physical behavior in response to the rotation block, and then a return to baseline behavior during the washout blocks. Baseline was, So behavior was similar across groups during the baseline phase, and this was to be expected. And both groups showed changes in hand heading during the rotation block, compensating for the visual perturbation. This is most apparent at movement number 56, where we see both groups making sharp changes in hand angle. In another set of graphs, we see individual participant performance represented by dots, and group means are represented by horizontal bars. Importantly, we are looking at only the beginning and end of the rotation block and the beginning of the washout block. This is the data I mentioned earlier that trials were binned into groups of 8. So what you see here is really the mean hand angle for the first and last 8 trials of the rotation block and first 8 trials of the washout block and baseline block, respectively. As we can see in figure D, early in the rotation block, the SEA group lagged behind the control group in compensating for the visual rotation, with the SEA group changing their hand angle by only 5 degrees versus the 20.7 degrees for the control group. The baseline block was not reported here, but both graphs had mean hand angles starting at 0 before the visual rotation. This trend continues late into the rotation block, with the SEA group only partially compensating for the rotation, but the control group reaching a near perfect change in hand heading angle in order to reach the target. To analyze significant relationships and interactions of group type and task performance, a mixed factorial repeated measure ANOVA was done. Excuse me, it's the relationships and interactions of group and time on task performance was what this ANOVA was trying to analyze. The results of this ANOVA are the following. A main effect of group and time were found, but no interaction between the two was present. Overall, both groups improved, but the control group improved the most. Focusing now on the last washout block, we see that an after effect was present for both groups. However, this effect was greater for the control group, meaning that implicitly speaking, the control group had more learning that took place over the rotation block that they had to unlearn during the washout block. Regarding the role that an explicit aiming strategy had in producing a change in behavior, we can see from the following graph that changes in reported aiming angle correlate with changes in hand heading angle. And I just made this finding easier to understand by connecting the relevant parts of graph A and B here. As you can see, as aiming angle changes, so does hand angle. Similar to the other results, we see a greater change in aiming location from controls than for SEA participants, showing that there is a clear difference in the explicit recognition of the problem between the two groups. This is demonstrated by graph E, where we see that over the course of the rotation phase, control participant mean aim angle changed from 13.3 to 22.1 degrees, significantly larger than the change for the SEA group, which started at 1.6 degrees and only rose to 13.3 degrees in an attempt to counter the full 45-degree rotation. Again, a mixed factorial ANOVA was done to establish the effective group and time on verbal aiming performance this time, searching for interactions as well. Again, here the factor of time is referring to only the early and late stages of the rotation block. A main effect of group and time was established, but no interaction. So aiming increased for both groups. Moving on to the real meat and potatoes of this research, we have the results on implicit learning, where again, implicit learning is calculated by subtracting hand heading angle from reported aiming angle. In figure C, we see that generally the control group had larger gains in implicit learning over the course of the rotation block. And looking at figure F, we see that the control group's implicit learning contribution increased from 2.8 to 14.6 degrees, which is in sharp contrast to the implicit learning within the SEA group, which is almost non-existent, changing from 0.6 degrees to 2.9 degrees. To compare changes in implicit learning, again, an ANOVA test was done with which found a main effect of group and time. As well, there existed a group time interaction. This is to say, implicit learning in SCA participants was impaired with reference to time when compared to the control groups. Excuse me. What this really means is that adaptation itself was impaired within the SCA group. Experiment 1 was important because it was able to distinguish performance changes resulting from both changes in aiming and implicit learning. By doing so, a dual impairment in SCA group was observed in both implicit adaptation and explicit changes in aiming location. The SCA group was only able to counter about 1/2 of the 45-degree visual rotation. Overall, this showed SCA participants had trouble discovering an aiming strategy on their own, and this contrasts with earlier research on how the cerebellum is only associated with implicit learning. Big idea for the results of experiment 2 is that gradual introduction of a rotation fails to alleviate impairment in aiming and adaptation as a result of cerebellar damage. As a reminder, the rotation block was comprised of 320 trials and had online cursor feedback to increase the contribution to implicit learning, meaning the participants could see the cursor as it moved to their aiming location. Not the case in experiment 1. This was for implicit learning purposes again. As in experiment 1, during the baseline block, both groups had similar performance from movement number 8 to 56, but both groups experienced a small clockwise bias, likely due to using the right hand. Early in the rotation block, we see that for both groups, the small rotational perturbation did not stimulate reliable changes in behavior. However, by the end of the rotation block, we can see that both groups did adjust, and this adjustment was much larger in the control group compared to the SCA group. So looking at figure A, we see that both groups ended the rotation block with changes to the hand angle, and figure D shows us that the control group changed hand angle by 35.3 degrees, a larger change compared to the SCA group's 18.2 degree change. Again, a mixed factorial ANOVA was done to assess main effect and interactions. A main effect of group and time was reported, as well as group time interaction, meaning that the SCA participants had difficulty compensating for the gradual change in rotation. These results replicate the findings done by the researcher at the bottom in that paper, and I'm not going to attempt to say that name. Regarding the after effect present in both SCA and control groups, we see from figure A and D, during the first 8 trials of the washout block, the after effect was much larger in the control group relative to the SCA group, meaning that the SCA group's implicit learning was impaired. So looking at figure D, specifically, we see that during the first 8 trials of the washout block, the control had a larger after effect, 26 degrees versus the SCA group's 16.6 degrees. Interestingly, changes in the verbal reports for both groups had little to do with changing the behavior. We see in figure B that over the course of the rotation block, aiming report changes very little. Yet, as you can see in figure 1, by the end of the rotation block, both groups had significant changes in hand angle. Regarding changes in aim, we can see from figure E, moving from early to late in the rotation block, the control group saw a change in aim from 2.4 degrees to 5.3 degrees. And interestingly, SCA participants did not shift their aiming location at all. In comparing the two groups, aiming across the entire rotation block, a t-test was used to establish significant differences in aiming. In general, despite obvious error by the end of the rotation block, SCA participants failed to adjust their aim completely. Again, a subtractive procedure was used to estimate implicit learning. Statistical analysis focused on first and last parts of the rotation block. And for the control group, an increase in implicit learning from 3.8 to 33.1 degrees was observed, and an increase from 2.3 to 13.2 degrees for the SCA group. A mixed factorial ANOVA revealed effects of both group and time, as well as an interaction. This showed that, as in experiment 1, control participants had a larger increase in implicit learning, and that SCA participants had an impairment in adaptation in response to gradual rotation. And here we are at the discussion. Overall, this data shows that damage to the cerebellum results in difficulty adjusting aim in response to visual motor rotation, and that these individuals experience difficulty using feedback in order to create their own aiming solution. One explanation for these findings is that behavioral changes reflect a disruption in a network that spans cerebellar and extracellular regions, implying more generally that the concept of executive function requires a network perspective to be fully appreciated. The researchers posit an action outcome maintenance account of impaired aiming in SCA, which implies that the cerebellum helps represent and maintain task relevant stimulus response associations across trials. And this is done through an intact cortex and cerebellar working motor memory system, which as we have seen in the control group's performance, allows for the simultaneous search for action rules at multiple levels of abstraction. Similar research and findings have been done by the following articles. Some implications of this proposed model suggest that the SCA participants had trouble adapting because of the number of possible targets, put too great a strain on their implicit learning system to generalize the across trial learning, leading to an impaired ability to counter the visual rotation in general. Some important avenues for future research could center around this growing notion that the cerebellum contributes to learning in general. A prediction that could be made using the outcome of this research is that SCA individuals would disproportionately show increases in performance on tasks similar to the one used in this research if that task was simplified by using only a single target location across trials. Some other things future research could focus on would be to try and find tighter correlations between damaged areas of the cerebellum and resulting behavioral deficits. Such research would contrast from it would contrast from the present study because spinal cerebellar ataxia results in broad deterioration of the cerebellum. And ending the presentation, I have some questions to prompt discussion. One would be, what could the implications of this research have on efforts to understand cognition in general? Number two, does this network approach make understanding the human brain even more difficult? Number three, what does the research say about the nature of learning? Is adaptation built on more basic mental processes like motor adaptation? And just closing us off, I have some personal thoughts. If we look back at experiment 1, we see that the change in aiming location doesn't account for the total change in behavior. Let's see here. So this implies a combo of implicit and explicit learning in producing the compensation of the 45-degree visual rotation for both groups. And this makes me think that even in seemingly explicit tasks, like choosing to aim off target with the idea of accounting for a visual discrepancy, implicit learning is still making up a significant portion of performance, roughly 1/4 of the performance if we look at these graphs here. But I don't know why I just did that. And to really make this point, in experiment 2, we see this to the extreme if we go to graphs A and B. Yep. Or A and D. Both groups had, oh, no, this isn't it. Here it is. Yeah, A and B. Both groups had almost no need to explicitly change their aiming location. The implicit changes to behavior accounted for almost all the learning. So this makes me think as well of, or I guess makes me think of education in general, and how is it that almost our entire education system completely ignores implicit learning altogether, and in the sense that we only are examined and graded on performance on explicit tasks, but what this research has shown is that depending on the circumstances, implicit learning is also important in making explicit changes in behavior. And perhaps these findings apply more to pedagogical efforts in non-higher education, but I think higher education could also benefit from rethinking future teaching methods to really leverage these implicit learning findings more. So that's all I have to say. And thank you.